Hey guys, Coach Logan here again, picking up my series once more on Blunders by World Champions. In the last video, we looked at blunders from Mikhail Botvinnik and Mikhail Tal, who I mentioned that Botvinnik was world champion for quite some time, like 15 years, but there were interruptions in that where Tal beat him once, and then earlier Smyslov beat him, and we're going to look at a blunder today from Smyslov, and then one from Alekhine, who was world champion before Botvinnik. So let's get started. So this was a game between Gligoric, who was a strong player in the mid 20th century, and Smyslov. And here, Smyslov is playing black, and we have this was from a Slav defense, which it's a little bit confusing because it might look like it's from a French defense with the pawn structure in the middle here, but you'll notice that his bishop is actually outside the pawn chain, which is uncharacteristic of the French, but happens in the Slav. And it's actually a relatively common theoretical position. And here, Gligoric played queen to e3, which, okay, so white has more space on the king side with this pawn on e5 and sort of has a sight set possibly on a king side attack. And these days, anybody who has this position would play, I believe, the most common move. I used to actually play this defense. And the most common move here is just bishop to e7, which helps control the g5 square, keeps away kind of any nastiness from this. And white could still make an attempt. They could play something like knight to g5, sort of invading on your king side there. But after an exchange and then bishop to g6, sort of counteracting white's powerful bishop on d3, we get a further exchange. And then I remember this. Like I said, I used to play this defense. Black actually recaptures with the f pawn, which is quite clever. It opens up the rook. So therefore activating another piece. This e6 pawn, okay, you could argue it weakens it, but it's quite hard for white to get it. And white does not have any light squared minor pieces, only this bishop. And if something like queen to g4, rook f5 is sufficient. And then one more nice idea I remember here was after white continues development, black actually usually argues that this knight is his worst piece and plays knight to b8 with the intention of coming to c6, and I think has a pretty nice position. I actually find it quite pleasant to play these positions as black. I think white sort of has a bad bishop. But okay, so in the game, I think maybe it's a little bit rough to call this a blunder, but Smyslov, I think, just underestimated this idea of knight to g5 and instead played sort of a more natural move of queen to e7, which directly connects the rooks and does not retreat his bishop. But I think that in fact, I'm not even thinking, he definitely underestimated his opponent's attacking chances here. Gligoric continued with knight to g5, which is quite strong. It attacks the h7 square, so it's directly threatening moves like just say bishop takes or some piece takes on h7. And the problem is now after pawn to h6, he must have missed white's next move, which is, I could give the audience a chance to pause if you want to try to come up with it, but it's a very nice way to continue the attack for white. Okay, so keep your videos paused if you'd like more time, but basically white said, I'm not going to go backwards with my knight, I'm just going to continue the attack by hitting one of your loose pieces. And we see that, as often is the case, loose pieces can fuel an attack because they can give your opponent pieces to keep attacking and keep the momentum alive. And white just plays queen h3 here, which is very, very strong. This bishop is under fire, and it doesn't really have a good solution. Okay, going to g6 is not really an option here because if, say, just bishop takes, now, unlike in the previous example, the e6 pawn would be hanging, so black is just going to lose material. But, I mean, what else is black going to do? If they play h takes g5, then after queen takes h5, again, the threat on h7 is quite strong. If black were to play something like g6 here, white could just grab this pawn and claim that they're up a pawn, but I think even stronger is just queen g4 and getting ready to take it with the bishop, and it's really hard for black to defend it because any f-pawn move will hang the g6 pawn to white's bishop. So black is probably just going to lose a pawn and still be under serious attack. In the game, Smyslov tried pawn to g6, but this wasn't really much better. G4 was a very nice continuation from Gligoric, just again, all systems go for the attack. H takes g5, g takes h5. Okay, so now we've managed to include the g-pawn in the attack. We get f6 from Smyslov. I mean, it's hard to come up with too many moves because white is just getting ready to take, open up the queen, and play h7. At least now Smyslov is covering the 7th rank, but it's sort of too little too late. E takes f6. We get knight takes f6. Pawn takes. So now here white's actually up a pawn in addition to being the one doing the attacking, so it's just really a bad position for black. Frankly, I could stop here. I mean, it's pretty clearly white is winning, but I'll just a few more moves. Knight to e4 was played, f3, knight goes into d2, looking to swap pieces, rook f2, knight to b3, and Gligoric simply just ignores the threat on his rook on a1 and just continues. In fact, he not only does he ignore the threat on a1, he even gives this bishop just to open more lines and create an attack. Queen takes g5 check, and now just rook to g2. And the point is queen to h7 is coming, and it's going to hurt. If queen to e7 here, for instance, to stop that, then just pawn to g7. And white's constellation of attacking pieces are enormously powerful. This bishop, this pawn now on g7, queen h8 is threatened. The pawn's going to promote. I mean, it's just a nightmare. So after rook g2, we had queen e3 check. King to h1, and here after king to g7, black is trying to avoid checkmate on h7, but it's just going to end up getting checkmated elsewhere. Queen to h7, king to f6, queen to h4 check. They repeated moves once, which is sort of a grandmaster thing to do. Pawn to g7, queen takes e5. So black is, in addition to everything else, they're down in material here too. Well, actually, sorry, black does have... Yeah, no, black is down in exchange here. So, I mean, this is really just resignable, but white now plays rook e1, which cuts off the king's escape square on e5, and the threat of rook g6 is overwhelming, so black resigned here. Okay, so again, maybe it was a little bit harsh judgment to call, you know, a misunderstanding of the position here with queen e7 like a blunder, but there's a reason now that everybody in this position just plays bishop e7. It's black's defenses are much more solid after that move. Okay, so that was a blunder from Smyslov. Now I'm going to hop into a game from Alexander Alekhine, who was a you know, a very accomplished world champion. Actually, the only player who died as world champion. You know, when his life ended, he was still world champion, which is pretty cool. And here he's on the wrong side of a game. I think I'm just going to check here. I think it was versus. Sorry, I don't want to give too much away, but I think it was versus Paul Keres. Okay, so I'm going to click this out again. And so we reached this position, and black has been sort of suffering in this game. I mean, they played not so great out of the opening and got themselves into some trouble, but has sort of reached a position where things are tenable. I think black can hold here. And they're down a pawn, and okay, you can argue that the structure is not great on the king side, but I think after here a move like, for instance, one thing I saw that seemed reasonable was bishop to h3 with this discovered attack on the white queen and an attack on the g2 pawn. Black is about to just take on g2 and fork the rook and knight in addition to everything else, so I think white's only move to try to keep this you know, some semblance of an advantage is knight to d4 here. Now attacking the bishop with check, so the queen is threatening to take, and it blocks the rook's threat on the queen. But after bishop takes g2, say rook to g1 and f3, I think black is holding. He's now equalized material. It's not so easy for white to really pursue an advantage here. The pawn on e5 could become weak. I think black's okay. In the game, though, Alekhine chose the wrong continuation and played f6, trying to undermine the e5 pawn, but it ends up just opening the e file on his queen. And so here he's definitely worse. He's down a pawn and he's getting attacked, but at this point, he just he goes for a really bad move here, queen to b4. I think maybe hoping to create some pressure on white's king. Potentially with something like, I don't know, maybe this rook lifting, or the rook that is lifted maybe can slide over and help out. But it actually just walks right into a 2-move tactic, 3-move tactic. So see if you can find what white played here. It was a nice finish from Keres. Okay, keep your videos paused if you want more time, but white is fully centralized and developed, and black's king, while not seeming like it's like horrendously unsafe here, it's not actually all that safe, and white has a tactic to win the game. White just plays a nice move here, queen takes d7, and I think black resigned here because if he were to recapture the queen, okay, so I mean, if he moves the king, we just take the rook too, and black is down a hopeless amount of material. But if you take the queen, black's back rank is just too weak. Rook to e8 check, and now he has to block, and then you could take with either rook, and it's checkmate. So, yeah, 2 interesting games from world champions. I think both. I tried to pick. What I did to pick these games is I was just like looking at a list of all the losses from Smyslov and from Alekhine, and these were right around the times that they were world champions. So, they were strong players at the time of these. These were very strong players who made mistakes. It happens to all of us. So, so yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that, and I will continue this series later. Bye, guys.